Jesus says, is not life more than food and the body more than clothes? In other words, he's saying there's more to meaning than just the things you acquire or the achievements that you succeed. I don't know if you've been to see the film Project Hail Mary that just came out over the past weekend. But I hear it's doing really well. And it's one in the latest line of a number of films that are so-called big idea films. They started back in about 2010. Films like Oppenheimer, films like Another Earth, films like Barbie even the Dune trilogy. These are all films which are seeking to grapple with big meta-narrative questions that are going on. Now, in one sense, films have always done that, but there's been a particular glut of these types of films in the last 10 or 15 years. So much so that Britt Marling, who actually starred in and wrote Another Earth back in 2011 when it came out, one of the beginning, kind of big idea films at the front of that wave, was asked about why it is that there are a number of films coming out like that, particularly now. And it was fascinating what she said in response. She said this: everyone in the Western world is hurtling at 500 miles an hour. There's a collective anxiety right now about how we're living. These movies are asking, how do we live a meaningful life? You know what she's saying? Everyone in the Western world has got this feeling that we're hurtling at 500 miles an hour. There's all these things going on. The pace of life is getting more. The questions that is provoking, also through the things that are going on in the world, are just there in front of mind. And she said, but underneath it all, we're trying to ask this really vital question. How do we make sense of it all? Where is their meaning? And actually, the arts has always been a forum in which those big questions can be explored. And that's why we've got these so-called big idea films. And that's a great summary, really, of the issue for us today and what we're going to be thinking about. So as we come to this passage from this ancient teaching of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount, which actually deals with this question, we're going to ask kind of three questions as we come to it. First of all, we're going to look at certain signs that there is a kind of deficit of meaning in our wider society. So what are the signs that there's something gone wrong when it comes to meaning and a deficit of meaning? Then we're going to look at the way we try to respond to that wrongly by constructing meaning for ourselves. And then we're going to look at an alternative of receiving meaning from Jesus rather than trying to construct it. So that's where we're going. Let's look, first of all, at signs of a deficit of meaning. You can follow the passage on your bulletins or in the Bibles if you have them. But it's interesting that Jesus asks a series of questions in this text. And really the central question is there in verse 28. When he asks this, why do you worry about your clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. Now, Jesus here highlights two symptoms, if you like, that show that there's a problem going on when it comes to meaning. And the two symptoms he highlights are, first of all, worry. Why do you worry about your clothes? And second, kind of frenetic, frantic, anxious activity, labor and spinning. He says they don't labor and spin, but you guys labor and spinning all the time. We give it the word here in New York, the hustle, right? You have your hustle, and that's the only way you make it in the city. You have a side hustle, you might even have a tertiary hustle. You don't get anything done without the hustle. It's a kind of frenetic activity that drives you. And Jesus says, why do you worry, and why are you hustling all the time? Now, you might answer that and say, well, look, the reason I worry and the reason I hustle all the time is because of circumstances. There are circumstantial issues going on in my life, Pete. Maybe you're worried about a friendship that's causing you problems at the moment. Maybe it's a bit of a broken friendship and you're not sure how you're going to work it out and reconcile. Maybe you're worried about job insecurity or food insecurity or where the money's going to come from for next month's rent. Maybe you're worried about your health. Maybe you're worried about a particular behavioral pattern that you thought you were in control of, but actually now you're starting to realize that it's got a bit of a hold on you, and maybe it's even controlling you, and you don't know what to do with it. Maybe you're worried about the news and the state of the world out there, and you're wondering, when is it going to impact here and be more closer to home, and you're worried about that. You might be saying, look, Pete, if you're asking me what I'm worried about all those things out there. Now, what I want to suggest to you, because it's what Jesus is suggesting here, is that those circumstances aren't really what you're worried about. They're just the context in which the deeper worry that you have is coming up. They're not the cause of your worry, strictly speaking. They're the context in which your worry surfaces. Because Jesus here, when he asks this question, why do you worry? He doesn't say, hey, don't worry. I'm going to fix that by sorting out all your circumstances for you. No, and that is therefore the reason that you can tell that the worry is deep in the circumstances, because even if your circumstances are fixed, you find out that you're still worried. Even when you achieve things, you find out that you still feel the sense of hustle and needing to do more and be more and struggling just to sit still, because it's not circumstantially caused. The circumstances are just the context in which it comes up. A philosopher who thought a lot about this is the Danish existentialist philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. He wrote a book called The Concept of Anxiety. And in it, he actually draws a dichotomy between fear and anxiety. He says fear are the things at surface level. So you're afraid of heights, or you're afraid of a relationship getting broken, or you're afraid of your health failing, or you're afraid of losing someone you love. These are the things we're afraid of. And they are the things that we directly deal with. He says, but underneath that, there's a deeper anxiety. I suppose we would call it angst. And he says it's caused by what he called the dizziness of freedom. In other words, when you face a world with lots of possibilities, but you feel untethered, unmoored, like you're not quite sure how to navigate it, how to make sense of the world, that's anxiety. That's the deeper malaise that you're facing. And look, if you look around at some of the statistics that people are aware of today, you'll see that this is a besetting problem for us. The American Association for the Psychiatric Industry said in 2024, 43% of adults said they felt more anxious than they did the previous year. 43% year on year felt more anxious. That was 37% in 2023 and 32% in 2022. In other words, we are getting more anxious each year that goes on at a deep psychological level, not just fearful, but anxious, this angst that kind of steps in. And I wonder if that's something you've noticed. Have you noticed that shift from fear to angst? It starts with a circumstance that you're worried about. You're worried about your job. But then actually you have job security, and yet the feeling in the pit of your stomach doesn't go away. You hustle, and you're hustling hard, and you think it's because you want to achieve something, and you say, I'm hustling, Pete, because I'm just trying to establish myself in my career as I come to this city. But once I've established, then I'll calm down, and then I'll get work-life balance, and then the hustle will be gone. You know what I've observed many, many times in London, also in New York? When people get that job promotion that they've said they would rest afterwards, they can't rest anymore. Because now they have this relentless pursuit inside of them all the time. They can't sit still, and so they just shift the bars and move the goalposts and say, well, that was just for becoming assistant partner, but now it's all about becoming partner. And then it's becoming about an equity partner, and then it just moves and moves and moves. In other words, some people are driven by the whips of their masters, but most of us in this city are driven by an inner restlessness that exposes a deeper malaise. A sign that there's something wrong, that we're not making sense of the meaning in the world in the right way, a deficit of meaning. Now, that leads us on then to the second question, which is, well, then how do we deal with this? And I want us to think about our flawed attempts to construct meaning. Our flawed attempts to construct meaning. We have those flawed attempts there in verse 28. Why do you worry about your clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. So one of the ways we try to construct meaning for ourselves is by our achievements, by our hustle, by the things we do, by our resume or by our academic record or by how well we're doing in life, the laboring and the spinning and all that achieves. The other way we try to do it is there in verse 26. Jesus says, look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. What's he talking about by sowing and reaping and store awaying in barns? Well, it's a metaphor as he looks at the animal kingdom, and he's saying, look, they don't need to acquire endless things. There's two ways that we try to construct meaning. We try to acquire stuff, and we try to achieve things. And we think if we do one or both of those, then we'll feel worthwhile. Then our lives will make sense. Acquisition. I mean, you only have to spend a little bit of time around this town that is New York City and realize that so many people are driven by the relentless pursuit of acquisition of money and wealth and getting the right things. A number of years ago, I was traveling. I was spending a bit of time in Cairo. I had a couple of hours to kill, so I was able to go to the Museum of Egypt in Cairo. And one of the centerpieces of the Museum of Egypt is the exhibit of King Tutankhamun and his burial chamber. King Tutankhamun was buried with all of his most treasured possessions. So he was buried with 6 chariots. And so as the curator was describing this to us, he was describing that his chariots were 2 ceremonial chariots for special occasions, 2 kind of everyday chariots for kind of getting around town, as it were, and 2 war chariots for when he was involved in military conquest. And so he had these kind of 6 chariots. Now, what was amusing to me was on the way over, I had been a bit bored on the plane, and so I flicked on the kind of TV bit to watch series on the plane. I'd come across MTV Cribs. And so I was watching an NBA star walk around his garage showing his 4 cars. You know, he had his car that he used for special occasions, his car for game day, his car for cruising, and his Humvee. And I was thinking, nothing's changed in thousands of years, right? The relentless pursuit of acquisitions. And so we have that kind of bumper sticker. He or she who dies with the most toys wins. No, they just die like everybody else. You can't take them with you. Where they're looking at an exhibit, would it be any different for any of us? Acquisitions don't give us meaning, even though we try to tell ourselves that they do. But the reality is, when you get them, you get bored with them. You then have to have a little bit more to keep up with the person who's got more than you. You have 4 cars, you need 5 cars. You get a 3-bedroom apartment, wouldn't it be nice to have a 4-bedroom apartment and a house out of town in the Hamptons, and so it goes on and on and on. Meaning can't be found there. Not in acquisitions, and not in achievements either. We often think that achievements will do it, and so many people come to this city thinking, well, if I can make it there, I can make it anywhere, and so this is where the town to do it, right? This is New York after all, and if I just achieve enough, then maybe the anxiety and the sense of restlessness will finally be gone. Then maybe I'll be able to sit still. Susan Orlean is a journalist for The New Yorker and an author of a number of books, and she's been observing this phenomenon of people coming to the city of New York, trying to achieve things, thinking that if only they did, they could be enough. And she wrote this one day on the reflection of her journalistic career. She said, like everyone else, I too had set out to be remembered. I'd wanted to create something permanent in my life, some proof that everything in its way mattered, that working hard mattered, that feeling things mattered, that even sadness and loss mattered, because it was all part of something that would live on. That's the relentless pursuit of achievements. If only I can do enough, or be enough, or make some kind of mark. We talked today about a legacy. I just need to leave a legacy behind me. I just need something that's going to live on. But it's never enough. Jesus says, is not life more than food and the body more than clothes? In other words, he's saying, there's more to meaning than just the things you acquire or the achievements that you succeed in. There's more than that. You can't be defined by that. You are more valuable than that. You're not just the sum of your achievements. Doesn't that feel shallow? You're not just the bank total and all your acquisitions. You know you're more than that.